What's up, y'all? Welcome back to Fish the Moment. In this video, I want to talk about why some professional anglers have 10 to 20 rods on the front deck of their boat, and other guys have like 2 or 3. So let's get into it. So I'm sure a lot of you guys have watched the Major League Fishing Tour, Bassmaster Elite Series, or FLW Tour, and seen that one pro with like 15 or 20 rods on the deck of their boat. The main culprit being Brian Thrift. He loves to have a ton of rods laid out very meticulously, perfectly lined up, and it seems like he has every bait in the tackle box tied on. But then there's the other pros who have like 2 or 3 rods on the deck of the boat all day, and they only pick up one of them, and that's the only bait they throw the entire day, and they also catch fish. And I find that both these techniques are successful, and guys can win tournaments with 20 rods on the deck of the boat, and some guys can win tournaments with 1 rod in their hand all day long. And so in this video, I want to explain why you might want to just have 1 rod in your hand all day, or why you might want to have 20 or 30 rods on the deck of the boat, and which approach might be best for you. So first, let's start with the guy who has 1 or 2 rods on the deck of their boat, sometimes with just 2 of the same bait on, and why they use that approach. And I find that this approach used to be really common in the 80s and 90s, and pros like Denny Brower and Tommy Biffle pop into my mind when I think about guys that would just put 2 or 3 rods on the deck of the boat and fish their strengths all day long. In Denny Brower's case, that was his Pro Mile flipping tube and a jig. He'd put those 2 baits on the deck of the boat, and he'd just fish them all day long. He might have a crankbait or a spinner bait off to the side, but you rarely pick it up, and he would win so many tournaments in the 90s just sticking to his strength and fishing 1 bait. But at the same time, a lot of those guys are kind of like hero or zero type guys. They'll do really well in one tournament and win, and then the next tournament they'll bomb and they'll have a finish in like, you know, the last 10% of the field. And I feel like this approach of having 1 rod on the deck of the boat is very susceptible to that. If the conditions aren't setting up right for the 1 or 2 baits you like to throw, or the 1 or 2 baits you've prepared for, you're not going to do very well. But if it does work, you'll have that 1 bait those fish are biting in your hand all day, and you're usually going to do really, really well. And so for some guys, this might be a really effective approach, especially if you're not that confident in a lot of different techniques. And I would actually recommend, if you are new to bass fishing or kind of at an intermediate level, that just putting 2 or 3 rods on the deck of your boat is not a bad thing, especially if they're baits that you have a lot of confidence in. So for example, let's say that you catch a lot of fish on a swim jig on your home lake in the summer, and you can go out pretty much every single day and catch fish on a swim jig, and it's a bait that you have a ton of confidence in. As long as you get in the right area of the lake, maybe find the right water clarity, you'll catch them. Well, if that's the case, then it may be to your benefit to stick with that swim jig as much as possible. And even if you hit a day when the conditions aren't quite right, or maybe another bait might be working better, those bad days will be outweighed by the number of good days you have just by having this confidence bait in your hand all day long. But personally, I'm not a fan of just having 1 or 2 rods on the deck of the boat and fishing those all day long. That kind of goes against the name of this channel, which is Fish the Moment. And I'm much more leaning towards the Brian Thrift approach of having, let's say, 8 to 12 rods on the deck of the boat and having a variety of things to throw at the fish on a given day based on the conditions that I face. And what I found over the years is that when I was fishing tournaments, I was very consistent using this approach. I would finish in the top 5 in a lot of tournaments. I didn't win as many tournaments as a lot of guys who would just stick to 1 approach all day long, but I was very consistent, winning a lot of anglers of the year and stuff like that. And that's kind of what my motivation was in tournament fishing. So let me explain why someone might want to have 10, 15, or even 20 rods on the deck of the boat, and why that might help you be a little more consistent as opposed to the guy who has 1 or 2 rods. So to explain this, let me give you a scenario of a fishing day and all the different conditions you might face within 1 fishing day. So let's say you're fishing during the summer, and in the morning, the first couple hours, you have low light conditions, no wind, and the sun is going to be coming out pretty soon. But you have some shade around the banks and the trees, and maybe some overhanging bushes and some grass look really good. And you might be able to go down the bank throwing a buzz bait or a spinner bait or a topwater frog and catch a lot of really good fish first thing in the morning in those low light conditions. But then as the day progresses, maybe that sun starts coming up, the low light conditions disappear, and you still have no wind. And from that 9 o'clock to noon time, maybe you need to start fishing a little more offshore, and you need to switch from the spinner baits, the buzz baits, and the frog to fishing a football jig or a drop shot or a shaky head. But then later in the afternoon, let's say from noon to 3, some cloud cover starts rolling in, you get some wind, and you can actually start getting more reaction bites. And so instead of catching fish on the jig, you might be able to do better on a crankbait or a swim bait or a flutter spoon, just because those conditions have changed. And as you can see, throughout this given fishing day, there's different baits that are going to be the most productive in each of these different weather conditions, times a day, and the mood of the bass. And as you can see, it might be to your advantage to have a lot of different baits tied on at the beginning of the day, so you can adapt as the conditions change to throw the right bait at the right time and the right conditions. But obviously, the only way you can do this is if you know the right adjustments to make. And this is why this approach is a lot better for your kind of intermediate to advanced bass fisherman who understands how the weather, the wind, the clouds, rain, time of day, all those things affect bass, and also has some experience knowing which baits to throw under those conditions. If you've never caught fish in the summertime before first thing in the morning on a buzz bait, you're obviously not going to have any confidence to do that. But if you've done that 2 or 3 times, that's a tool in your toolbox you can use. And this is why Brian Thrift has 15 or 20 rods on deck of the boat. He has a really in-depth understanding of how fish behave and how the weather and the lake conditions affect how these fish will bite. And he has a ton of tools in his toolbox that he can use to put fish in the boat. And so he actually knows when to pick up that random white swim jig he has on the deck of the boat, or the deep diving crankbait, or the shaky head, or the floating worm, or whatever else he has on the deck of his boat. He'll have like 30 rods out. And sometimes he might not pick up all those rods. Maybe he only picks up 2 or 3 of the rods because the conditions don't present themselves to throw 90% of the baits. And so at the end of the day, he may only throw 2 or 3 baits, just like the guy who puts 2 or 3 baits in the deck of their boat. But the difference between Brian and the guy who only has 2 or 3 rods out is that the 2 or 3 baits that Brian's fishing are going to change based on the weather and the day he's fishing. So one day he might be picking up all the crankbaits and throwing those. The next day he might be picking up all the jigs. Next day all the topwaters. Where some guys would just only have jigs, and they're going to throw a jig regardless of the weather, regardless of the bass are eating it. They're just going to force those fish to eat a jig. And in my experience, I mean, you can catch fish in a jig, you can catch fish on a crankbait pretty much year-round in any time of day, any season, but you just have to find the right water and the right conditions to get those fish to bite. And this is why both approaches can be successful in tournament bass fishing. It all comes down to a difference in strategy between the guys who have a lot of fishing poles on the deck of the boat and guys who have very few. And one thing I've learned from watching pretty much every bass fishing tournament dating back to the 1980s is that the guys who stick with 1 or 2 approaches or 1 or 2 baits are the most successful when they hunt out the water that's the most conducive for their technique, regardless of the body of water they're on. So for example, Tommy Biffle used to be known for shallow water flipping. He liked to flip shallow laydowns, grass, and any sort of cover in 5 feet of water and less in dirty water. And so Tommy would be really successful whenever they would go to the Mississippi River or a dirty water fishery where he can fish up shallow and there's a lot of water all over the lake for him to fish. But he was also successful on lakes that were deep and clear despite not having the right type of cover in the majority of the lake. And that's because instead of trying to fish in the clear water like the rest of the field, he would run 30 to 40 miles up a river to find the little bit of dirty water that was available. And he would stick with his strength, flipping shallow cover, and he would catch fish. Now, he wasn't fishing in areas that had a lot of fish, but he normally had these areas somewhat to himself, and so he just maximized the area because he was so proficient, so skilled at shallow flipping that he was able to still compete with the guys who were fishing in areas that had a lot more fish and had a healthier population of fish in general. But on the flip side, you have guys that have 10, 15, or 20 rods on the deck of their boat, like Brian Thrift, and Jacob Wheeler also does this, as well as Edwin Evers. And these guys are super consistent, and they're some of the best anglers in the world. And what I've found is that the strategy they like to use is identifying an area of the lake with a large concentration of fish, a healthy fish population. And they're not so much worried about trying to fish a specific type of water. They're not going and saying, I'm going to fish a jig, I'm going to fish a crankbait. They go in with an open mind, and they're not afraid to fish in 2 foot of water with a buzzbait or a spinnerbait, or 30 foot of water with a big jig, a crankbait, or a drop shot. And so what they're really focused on is just identifying where they can find a lot of fish, and they'll adapt their presentation based on what the lake and the weather gives them. So for example, if they're in one section of the lake they found that has a ton of fish, one day they may have to catch those fish shallow, flipping laydowns and throwing the spinner bait, but the next day they may have to pull off 10 to 15 feet off the bank in some offshore structure and catch them on brush piles with a deep diving crankbait and a 10-inch worm. And they're perfectly comfortable making these adjustments because they're very versatile anglers. And that's the reason they have so many rods on the deck of their boat. They want to be able to easily shift between fishing offshore to fishing shallow and seamlessly transition between the two. And this is the key to having a lot of fishing poles on the front deck of your boat. It only works when you're very confident in a variety of techniques and you're a versatile fisherman. And all the guys I mentioned, Brian Thrift, Jacob Wheeler, Edwin Evers, they're all really versatile and they're great offshore fishermen as well as shallow fishermen, and they can switch between techniques very easily. Therefore, they need to have all of the potential tools at their disposal in case they need to make a quick switch between shallow and offshore fishing. And this is what I like to do, and it's how I've been successful over the years, is being able to adapt to the conditions on the water and quickly change my approach. And so for me, it's really helpful to have 8 to 12 rods on deck of the boat when I go fishing, because I'm confident in using a lot of different rods, a lot of different baits, and a lot of different presentations. But for a new angler or someone who isn't as versatile, it may actually be counterproductive to have 8 to 12 rods on deck of the boat, and it will hurt you more than it will help you, because if you're not confident in throwing, let's say, a deep diving crankbait or a 10-inch worm offshore, you're probably not going to catch that many fish on it anyways until you spend time on the water gaining confidence with that technique. And so if your goal when you're going to the lake is to catch as many fish as possible, whether it's for a fun fishing day or a tournament day, the best thing you can do is stick with the baits you're confident in and try to find a section of the lake that sets up to your style. Now, if you are very versatile, then that's great. Find a section with as many fish as possible, put 12 rods on deck of the boat, and try to throw the best bait in the best conditions based on your experience. But if you don't have as much experience, go for the 1 or 2 baits that you know you can catch fish on, that you have confidence in, and run around the lake, changing areas and sections of the lake until you find an area where the fish are biting your favorite lure. And that's going to put a lot more fish in the boat and make you a lot better angler as you continue to grow and develop your skills. And so, both are very effective. Both have won a lot of tournaments and won guys a lot of money over the years. And again, if you're a beginning to intermediate fisherman, just getting into tournaments maybe, it may not be bad to just stick a few rods on the deck of the boat, stick to what you're confident in, and not experiment with a bunch of new baits when you don't know how they work. This will usually put more fish in the boat just because confidence is such a huge player in bass fishing. But if you are confident in a lot of techniques like I am and have tried pretty much every bait under the sun and just fished in a lot of random conditions, it may not be bad to have 10 or 15 rods on the deck of the boat. And that's, again, kind of my style. I'll have 8 to 12 rods out on a given fishing day because I'm confident in a lot of different baits and I know when to make the adjustments when they're needed. And so definitely an interesting topic. I hope this was kind of interesting to you guys. And there's a lot more I could have talked about around the subject, but I didn't want to overwhelm you guys in one video. And a lot of these topics are things I'm going to get into in future videos. For example, how Brian Thrift identifies that zone that he likes to fish where he cycles through all his baits, or maybe how to learn a brand new bait that you're not confident in so you can build up your repertoire or skills with a lot of different fishing lures. So many topics to talk about, so many things I'm going to get into in the near future. As you guys might have noticed, I'm going to be posting a lot of videos going forward, 4 videos a week every Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and Sunday. And so definitely stay tuned to Fish the Moment. Check back to the channel if you want some really great fishing content. I'll be doing on the water videos, a lot of on the water videos since the temperature is getting warmer here. I already have like 3 filmed that I'm going to be putting out, and just a lot of other great content hopefully that will help you guys become better bass fishermen and put more fish in the boat in 2020. So hopefully everyone's staying safe out there, enjoying the outdoors when you can, and hopefully I'll see you guys out in the lake once all this stuff calms down. So thanks again for checking out the video, and I'll see you all next one.